So this evening, for Curious Histories, we're extraordinarily delighted to welcome Lindy Malloch, who is a local historian of Ayrshire, a graduate from the Open University's MA programme in local history, and a guide at Dumfries House. And her talk this evening is on the peculiar politics of Dumfries House in the 18th and early 19th century, which is really based on incredibly meticulous archival research at the house itself, or the house's archive, rather. And that's, I think, going to prove to be a rather intriguing introduction to what is, for me, a kind of a very unusual subject. It's not a subject I knew very much about until Lindy started working on it. So it's 19th century, sorry, 18th century Scottish politics, which are, as I'm sure Lindy will now reveal, rather more complex and Byzantine than we might imagine. Okay, Lindy, are you ready to go?
Yes, I'm going to go on to share. Thank you very much, Stuart. Well, I already recognise some names there, so I better start off by apologising to many of the guides who know more than I do. But first of all, let me introduce Dumfries House, and in particular where it is. It is in the lowlands of Scotland. But in fact, the lowlands are not necessarily low, and part of Dumfries House actually lies in the southern uplands of the lowlands of Scotland. So work that one out if you can. It lies on the edge of the Ayrshire Plain to the southwest of Scotland. So part of the farmland on the estate is fertile, but part of it is upland, and it means that the land is poorer with high rainfall and the everlasting winds from the southwest that we get in Ayrshire. And if you look at the map of Scotland and look where it says lowland, Dumfries House Estate is probably around about where the L is on lowland. And if you go to the map next to it, which is a modern day map, and go inland from the coastal town, the county town of Ayr, you will see Cumnock and New Cumnock. And Dumfries House lies just outside Cumnock. Ayr is to the west, Glasgow is to the north, and Edinburgh to the east. The one other place that I should point out to you on that map is if you move down to the very southwesterly tip of Scotland, you will see the town of Stranraer. And the gentleman that I'm really interested in, the 6th Earl of Dumfries, Patrick Crichton MacDougall of Fruch, he is from Galloway and he has land just outside Stranraer. And in fact, I should have given you a map to show you how close we are to Ireland. There's a huge, always been an important relationship between the Southwest and Ireland, and that's important for Patrick too. Anyway, onto the house. And here is a lovely photograph of Dumfries House in the winter sunshine. It was built between 1754 and 1759. Its style is Neo-Palladian, and although it is a really early work of Robert Adams, in fact, it is much more in the style of his father, William Adam. And this house was scaled down and became simpler and simpler through a series of drawings by Robert Adam, because the 5th Earl of Dumfries, who built this house, never had enough money, really. And in fact, I think that the simplifying of the house, the taking away of ornamentation, embellishment, is what gives this house actually its real charm. It is very simple, very symmetrical, and very elegant, typical Neo-Palladian style. And just a little bit of hard sell for the people that don't know Ayrshire. We are lucky enough in Ayrshire to have Robert Adams very first major commission, which is Dumfries House, but we also have his very last major commission as well, which is Culzean Castle. So you should come and visit them both and realise, of course, that Dumfries House is by far the superior. I'm waiting for someone to shoot me for saying that. The fifth Earl always wanted the very best, and he purchases for his house by going to London and to Edinburgh, where he buys lovely furnishings. And really, that's what the house is famous for now, I think. He buys Thomas Chippendale, early young Thomas Chippendale, who's moved to St. Martin's Lane in London from Yorkshire, and he buys ready-made furniture that is there, and it is unique. There is nothing else like it. It doesn't appear later on in his catalogues, the gentleman's director. We have unique furniture, early Chippendale, and much of it is Rococo, which is very unusual. And I've given you a little picture of the furnishings, which comes from the catalogue from when the house was going to be sold in 2007, and the contents were going to be shipped off to Christie's in London for sale. It didn't happen, of course, because everyone will know that the king intervened. But this catalogue, never mind the furnishings, this catalogue is now collectible. If you can get your hands on one for under £1,000, you're doing pretty well. The other little picture I've given you is, I think, the most well-known piece in the house, and it's our little bookcase, which is a very beautiful little piece. I'm not going to tell you any more about it. You have to come to Scotland and visit it if you haven't seen it. So let's meet the gentleman who built the house. He was the 5th Earl of Dumfries. His name was William Crichton Dalrymple. He inherits his title and his estate from his mother, not from his father. And he inherits in 1742, but in fact he's a soldier away on the continent fighting in the wars of the Austrian succession, and he doesn't come back until 1747. He was with George II at the Battle of Dettingen, which is worth remembering because it is the last battle where a monarch led the army into battle. Although I do use that term, leading the army into battle, quite loosely. I don't think that really the king was that near. But the 5th Earl was there. He was aide-de-camp to his uncle, the 2nd Earl of Stair. This lovely painting sits in the dining room and has done since 1759, painted by Thomas Hudson, who was the very best portrait painter in London. There is a very similar painting of George II in the same pose. And I think that the 5th Earl will deliberately have chosen to copy that painting for 2 reasons. 1, he gets to imitate the king, and 2, he'll have got a cheaper price for his portrait. Thomas Hudson was known to flatter his sitters, which I think is probably quite a wise thing to do if you're a portrait artist, because you do want to be paid for your painting. And in fact, he has, I'm quite sure, flattered the 5th Earl of Dumfries. Just look at those legs. I do not think that they are the legs of a 60-year-old. But hey, I don't really know. The lovely thing about this painting too is that he should have been painted in his military outfit. He was at Dettingen with George II, a really important battle. Not only did George lead the army, but we won it as well. But he's chosen, the 5th Earl has chosen to be painted in his Earl's robes. Around his neck, he's got his collar for the Order of the Thistle. He's appointed to the Order of the Thistle by George II, probably because they were at Dettingen together. And the 5th Earl is so proud of this Order of the Thistle. He just is, it's everywhere. The house is full of thistles in all sorts of places. And there are accounts of people who receive the award who have it pinned to their nightgown when they go to bed. And I'm quite sure that the 5th Earl had that done as well. In his hand, he is holding the contract for the building of the house. We still have that contract. You can see, I hope, just peeking out underneath the coronet, the little slip of paper. When the painting was cleaned, that could be identified as Robert Adams' drawings. So I think it's very clear where William Crichton Dalrymple's feelings lie. He's hugely proud of his house. I have to tell you a little bit about his family, though, because the family are really important in Scottish history. The Dalrymples of Stair were originally small barons, but they became involved in lawmaking. They became lawyers in the 1600s, and really towards the end of the century, they were holding really important government positions. They were Protestants. Not only were they Protestants, they were Presbyterians. And not only were they Presbyterians, they were Covenanters. They were having no truck with Roman Catholicism or the Jacobite movement. Now, the Covenanters got their name because they signed a covenant as early as 1638, saying that they wished to practice their faith in their way, and no man had the right to interfere with that. Therefore, they did not accept the divine right of the Stuart kings, and they didn't want any intervention from the Stuart kings either. That meant the Covenanters were persecuted and killed at various points by both Cromwell and Charles II. The Dalrymples, though, were very canny because they always managed to prosper. Others lost their heads and their lands, but not the Dalrymples. They managed to keep their faith, but also survive very well in government positions. The gentleman in his lovely wig is Viscount Stair, and the print next to him shows the book, The Institutions of the Law of Scotland. And this man is responsible for Scotland's legal system today. And there isn't a student at university who does not know the name of James Dalrymple and this book. And in fact, what's very interesting, I think, about the Institutions of the Law of Scotland, people say that there's a strong similarity between Scottish law and the law of the Low Countries. And in fact, the Viscount Stair, James Dalrymple, was persecuted and fled to the lowlands. They did spend a lot of time there too. His son becomes the first Earl of Stair, and he is unfortunately remembered for really a fairly heinous crime. He signed the warrant for the massacre of Glencoe in 1692, which I'm sure most of you will have heard about. The MacDonald clan were murdered in the dark of winter by the Campbells, who had sought shelter during storms, and they broke every rule of clan hospitality. In the middle of the night, they rose up and killed about 30 MacDonalds. And the first Earl of Stair was, he was happy for this to go ahead. He signed the warrant for their death. And it's not a proud bit of their story at all. But very interestingly, the building of Dumfries House was paid for by money that came from the end of the clan system. Post-Culloden, there was an act called the Abolition of Heritable Jurisdictions. The positions of power that clan chiefs had held, which gave them such control over their clansmen, was taken away in 1747, but they were compensated for it. And our fifth Earl, he too was compensated for it, and it must have gone to pay for at least some of it for the building of the house. We're now on to my favourite. This is the gentleman that I have spent a lot of time researching, and he is very important to me now. Patrick Crichton MacDougall. The 5th Earl died in 1768, no direct heir, no children of his own to survive him. And the estate was left to Patrick, and he was the 5th Earl's nephew, his sister's eldest boy. The estate was left entailed, and that happens so often on the big estates. An entail actually could create huge problems because it prescribed what you could do to an estate. It meant that you couldn't borrow on it. It meant that you couldn't alter possibly farming methods and techniques. So it made it very difficult for Patrick, who was desperate to get stuck in and start improving the estate. Although his uncle had done some improvement too. Patrick, as you can see from this lovely painting by an unknown painter, probably painted in his 30s, we think, he's a career soldier, and he ends up becoming a colonel in the army, and there's no doubt that he loved his army career. He writes such a lot about it. He's stationed in London at the Tower for a while. He's stationed in Edinburgh at the castle, and he gives up his commission very reluctantly. His family have huge Irish connections too. When he inherited his own estate, because he inherited from his father, he inherited an estate that was really not aristocracy. He comes from a background that is gentry. And the estate that came from his father came with a falling down castle, several brothers and sisters that he had to provide for, several ancient aunts, and I think he must have acquired Fruch, that estate, with lots of issues and debt as well. Here's his family. I love this painting. This is his grandfather. He died in 1689, so we know this painting was painted before that. And there is his grandfather, looking very pleased with himself in his red robes, with his wife and 2 of his several daughters and their lap dogs. They were also Covenanters, like the Stairs. Unlike the Stairs, they were not so good at prospering. And when Cromwell came up to Scotland, he burnt down their castle. And when Charles II was restored, he simply took the lands off the MacDowalls of Fruch. They always seem to be on the wrong side. This painting is by William Aikman, and we're going to come across a family member of his later on too. So let's go on to Patrick's marriage. Patrick marries a lady called Margaret Crawford in 1771. It is a hugely successful marriage. She's a lot younger than him. He's in his 40s when she marries. When he marries, she's in her 20s. But it appears to have been a love match, or certainly a match that they both desired, because Margaret turned down other suitors in the hope of Patrick proposing to her. There's an anonymous letter to Patrick, signed from a sincere friend, obviously a woman as well. And she writes like something out of a Jane Austen novel, that she has heard that Miss Crawford has turned down a certain gentleman in the hope of the Earl of Dumfries in the hope of the Earl of Dumfries proposing. And she has a great deal of impudence with such expectations. Well, her expectations were met and they married. There was, great regard shown for each other in the many letters that exist, written perhaps not between them, but writing about each other. And she is a very important lady in the running of the estate. She's involved in agriculture, especially linen production, because they grow a lot of linen on the estate and receive premiums for that. They grow so much that they actually get financial rewards. She's involved in political intrigues with Patrick, and she's heavily involved in all the local industry that the pair of them are desperate to develop on their estate. She again is from a more modest background. She's the daughter of an Edinburgh advocate, a writer to the Signet. They're basically lawyers who have positions with the Crown as well. She has several other sisters too. One of them marries a nabob and they live nearby in Rosemount, outside Ayr. And another sister, Kitty, comes and stays at Dumfries' house a great deal. And these women inherit money when their father dies, and they all keep it. They are thoroughly modern women who have modern husbands too. They keep their own money, and they would appear to have several thousand each, and they invest it in local businesses as well. They have one child, Elizabeth Penelope, and she's the little girl on the right. But they adopt the little girl at the bottom, Flora Campbell. She's born in 1780. She is the Countess of Loudon by the time she is 6, which is a nearby estate. Both her parents are dead, and nobody wants little Flora. She doesn't initially come to the house when she is orphaned, but Patrick is asked to be her tutor, which really means her legal guardian. And she comes to the house, and Patrick writes that they will love her because that is their duty. And I think she's accepted and welcomed into the house, and clearly they grow to love her because he writes what an addition she is to the household, how much they all enjoy her. And in fact, Flora is with Patrick for the rest of his life. He loses so many people throughout his life, but Flora stays with him. The two top paintings are by a young lady called Anne Forbes. Now, she is the granddaughter of William Aikman. And it's thought that she's related to Margaret Crawford. I'd love to see some evidence for that, but she certainly spends a lot of time at the house, and her story is interesting. As a small child, it's observed that she has talent, artistic talent, and that is nurtured. Her father dies, but her mother still takes her off to the continent, where she is tutored by the very best artists available. She comes back to London as a young woman, where it is thought she should be able to make a living as an independent artist. But in fact, she does not keep well, and she ends up coming up to Scotland, spends a lot of, she does do a lot of painting, but she spends a lot of time at Dumfries House and does not live a long life. And the hard sell, I'm afraid. There is an exhibition on in Tate Britain, I think starting in May, and it's on women artists, and we are sending down, I think, at least one painting by Anne Forbes. I think it might be the very lovely one there of Lady Margaret. And in fact, it was Stuart that was pointing out to me the other day what a polite painting it was. Everyone wished to be considered polite. It was an indication of how cultivated and cultured you were. And there's Lady Margaret in her turban, showing awareness of other cultures, other countries. And in her hand, she's showing a book. She is holding a book. She is an educated lady who reads. Poor little Flora is just playing, poor little Elizabeth Penelope is playing with her pet lamb. I think it's kind of a very scary looking little pet lamb. I don't think I'd have liked my children to play with it, but nevertheless, there she is with her lamb, and underneath we have Flora, and that little excerpt is actually taken from a very lovely Rayburn painting of her. Flora stays with Patrick until he dies, and 2 years after his death, she marries a great friend of Patrick's, who is the Earl of Moira and the Marquis of Hastings. He's decades older than Flora, but it appears to be an incredibly happy marriage. Certainly they have lots of children, and her husband, who spends a lot of time at sea, he requests, should he die at sea, that his hand be severed from his body and returned to Flora, so that in death their hands could be united together. It's a strange request, but in fact he did die at sea, and his hand was cut off from the rest of his body and returned to Flora. And they both lie, Flora and her husband's hand, in Loudon Kirk in the family mausoleum. So Patrick turns his attention to politics. And what were politics like post-Union in Scotland? So the Union of 1707 had the Union of 1707 had meant that the English got a secure border. For the Scots, they'd hoped for economic improvement and prosperity. Now, it did not happen, certainly not immediately. Some people actually received significant sums of money, but in fact, the early 1700s were a dreadful time for Scotland. Terrible weather, terrible famine, and lots of hardship for people. The way the political system remained, but it altered quite a lot. And 45 Scottish MPs went down to Westminster, whereas before the Union, 125 MPs sat in Scotland in a parliament in Edinburgh. So that's a huge reduction. And clearly, there's not going to be a shortage of candidates. And in fact, Patrick's aware from a very early time, in 1757, long before he inherits, he says, a seat in Parliament may get me a rich wife and military preferment, but will require much economy, or ruin may ensue. So he doesn't want to join politics for any kind of moral upstanding reasons. He's much more interested in his personal background. He's always on the lookout for a rich wife because he's always got debt behind him, at least until the later 1700s. And he's always trying to climb the military ladder because he loves his life, and the higher he can climb, the greater the income he can make. He's also aware that going to London is going to be an expensive affair. He would have relied on his uncle, the fifth Earl of Dumfries, in fact, to put him forward for this, but it doesn't happen at all. And Ayrshire, if we look at its own particular politics, are unusual. Ayrshire had a large number of voters, 128 in the 1774 election, and that's the one election I found a lot of research on and is a really important election. Scotland overall only had about 2,500 voters. 0.2% of the population could vote. Very few people could vote. So Ayrshire had way more voters than most other counties. And what was interesting about these voters was that many of them were small, independent landowners. That meant they had a lot of power. And patronage became essential. if the great landowners of the county wanted people to vote the way they wanted them to vote, to support their interest, they would offer favours and rewards to voters. So Patrick, as the Earl of Dumfries in the 1770s, knows very well that he needs to persuade not just those people on his estate who he can expect to vote for him if they have a vote, but the local small landowners as well. And he writes to his brother John, and John is a stalwart for Patrick. John is always at his side, helping him do all sorts of schemes that they get into, but he helps him in the political arena. And Patrick writes to John and says, "Pray neglect not Hamilton of Grange, who has only got 2 votes, but Patrick knows that they are important." And this whole thing of persuading people to support you was not heavy-handed. You didn't go out and offer money. You had to socialize with them. You had to persuade them and cajole them. And Patrick would have been excellent at this, along with his brother. So what happened in 1774? Well, for those, or for some, it was a disaster. And the Dowager Countess of Eglinton, writing to a friend, writes in 1774, "Great struggles is through all poor Scotland, and nothing prevails but corruption." And that was because the elections that year in particular were so unusual. I have to say that her view is slightly biased, because her son was guilty of some of the kind of very poor behaviour that went on in the 1774 election. But this election was a really important election because there was no one in control of Scottish politics. Up until really the mid-1700s, either the First Minister in London in Parliament would control what was happening in Scotland, or someone in Scotland would work on their behalf. But it was all a bit vague after the Act of Union. And in the 1770s, nobody was in control. So I think all the landowners thought they would do just what they wanted, and they did. The 1774 elections. The Earls of Loudon, Castles and Eglinton, 3 big estates in Ayrshire, got together and they thought that they would present their own candidate to the House of Commons, their own MP, and they planned to control politics for the next 21 years. In some ways, I quite admire them. I think they've got a long-term view. How unusual to see that in politics. But they neglected to get the small and independent landowners on side. And they were really unhappy about this and were not going to cast their vote for the 3 Earls' man, who was the nephew of Castles. These were Kennedys, and that was David Kennedy. They were not going to support David Kennedy. They decided they were going to put up their own candidate. And most of you, I'm sure, will know James Boswell of Dr. Johnson. His father, Lord Auchinleck, a well-respected judge, he had a small estate which bordered with Dumfries House. And he said that if the 3 lords, the 3 earls got their way, then it would be the annihilation of the gentleman's interest. Now, Patrick decides not to go with the great landowners, and really he should have done in many ways, because he's related to the Earl of Loudon. It's little Flora Campbell, who is the Countess of Loudon, that he takes on. It's her uncle. He decides he's going to go with the smaller landowners. And I think a lot of this is because, in a way, that's his background. He is gentry. He also never likes being told what to do. He's a covenanter. They're into liberty, not just religious liberty, but personal liberty. You make choices about what you do. And his politics are liberal for the time, at least. They put up a really suitable candidate. Sir Adam Ferguson of Kilkerran is a really well-liked and well-respected lawyer, and he is proposed as their member or as their candidate to sit for the county of Ayr. I've just given you a little painting of the 4th Earl of Loudon. He's looking, I think, rather handsome in his army outfit, apart from the kilt. The kilt is his own. And this painting is painted by Ramsay in 1747, when in Scotland you're outlawed. The wearing of the kilt is outlawed, but clearly not for the Earl of Loudon. And there are lovely accounts of this man who never married, stayed single all his life, but was apparently a hugely handsome man. At the time of elections, he would ride about his estates and the county, trying to persuade the ladies of the houses to give him their support, because it was well recognised that if you have the ladies of the house on side, then you have the gentlemen of the house on side too. So who could vote? If only a few people could vote, how were they defined? Well, that was a bit of a problem in itself. You had to be what is termed a freeholder in order to vote. Freeholders were those who possessed land that had been valued at 40 shillings Scots, dating from something that was termed Old Extent. Old Extent was a really ancient valuation system dating back to the feudal system, but was never written down. There's no evidence of it ever having existed. So in fact, straight away, that's a problem, because you can't debate what laws say your land existed. You can't challenge that in any way. So in the 1600s, there was an alternative addition. So land held from the Crown with a yearly rental of £400 Scots also conferred the right to vote. So you had to have land that was valued either at 40 shillings under Old Extent or £400 Scots sterling under Acts in the 1690s. But it is not the possession of land that gives you the right to vote. It's the fact that you hold land from the Crown. You hold land in vassalage or superiority. So it's not the value of the land, it's the giving of the land. And it took me forever to get my head round this, because the king gives land to a noble. And in feudal times, then it would have been the duty of the nobleman to provide men-at-arms. That's gone, of course, by the time we get to the mid-1700s. But it's not the land that the king gives that's important here. It's the act of giving. The land is a physical thing. The superiority is not, because it is the act of giving. And there's nothing physically to show that other than the land, but that is separate. So once you get your head around that, which took me forever, it meant that technically, if you could separate your superiority from the land, then you could separate your vote from the land, because the vote is the result of the superiority, the act of giving you land, not the possession of the land. And in some ways you think, okay, so if you've got land valued at £400 Scots, then you've got one vote. If you've got land that's valued at £800 Scots, you've got two votes. But in fact, the land, when it was given in the 1600s and earlier, the size was not defined. So how do you value that land if it's not defined by size? And there were all sorts of issues with deciding what land you owned. You needed lots of lawyers to help you do this. They were the only ones that really understood this system. And thankfully, in Scotland, in the late 1700s, there were many, many lawyers because, of course, there's no parliament sitting in Edinburgh anymore. And you have a whole strata of men who would have been in politics, but have to find different careers. And there were many, many lawyers. So what happened in Ayrshire and on Dumfries House estate? So the idea is there that land and superiority can be separated. Therefore, you can create new votes. And in fact, it was built into the system that you could separate land and superiority and create new votes. And it always happened in the past, and it was called nominal voting. But what happens, particularly at the 1774 elections, is that a huge number of new votes were created. Superiorities were separated from land and lots of votes created for a landowner to persuade people. Well, the landowner gave his land to others who would vote in the landowner's favour. And of course, that is called, or that then becomes known as fictitious voting, because in fact, the votes that are being created, these are not real votes, really. This is not someone owning land that is theirs forevermore and voting as they wish. There was a certain morality about this too. People did think it was not quite right to do this. And Patrick writes to his brother, "Oh, self-defense allows we use the same arms our adversary does. And I think it for the honour and interest of this family, we do so." So he blames the other side for starting it. And his honour is being impugned here. So he's absolutely got to do something about it. I do think he is trying to justify himself a little bit here. So they set about creating new votes on their estate. Many different ways of doing it. The simplest one would be simply to divide your estate up into 40 shilling lots. So for example, if you had an estate that was valued at, say, 400 shillings under old extent, you'd split your land up into parcels worth 40 shillings each. So you'd get 10 votes out of that. You would keep 1 for yourself, 9 you would sell to other people that you knew, often family members, and they would vote for you. And then they would or should give the land back to you. But you can see that there's a problem there straight away, because you might not get your land back. So in fact, the lawyers develop more and more very clever and new systems and new types of fictitious votes. And you can see that on Dumfries House estate, they develop 43 new votes. And what's really lovely is that they actually discover, when they're looking at land, and Lady Margaret's heavily involved in this, when they're trying to find out what land is actually theirs on the estate, they discover that one of the parks is actually not theirs. It doesn't belong to them at all. It belongs to Logan of Logan. So you can actually lose land, and you can also gain it when trying to find out what is yours. And of course, it would never have mattered up until really the early 1700s, because land was not measured by size. There was no enclosure. It didn't matter. And when I looked at all estate leases or tax in Scots, then I could always find the rents that people paid, but I could never, ever find the size of the different farms. Anyway, they set to with Patrick, with his wife, both busy doing things on the estate for Adam Ferguson and his brother George Ferguson, who becomes involved. They bring in another writer to the Signet, Andrew Tate. He's very busy too. And this is a hugely expensive affair. It cost Patrick nearly £300. So clearly he's sorted out his estate or he's sorted out his finances to some extent, and he has sold his commission and he has sold lands in Fruch to deal with a lot of the financial embarrassment he did have. So will those 34 votes be enough for him in the 1774 election held on the 13th of October? Election voting is done in public, a show of hands is taken. It's usually a pretty riotous affair, and everyone turns up to cast their vote. And David Kennedy has more voters on the voters' roll already registered than Adam Ferguson, which means that David Kennedy should have been elected and carried the day for the three Grey Earls of Ayrshire. But in fact, George Ferguson intervenes. And he suggests that the trust oath be taken. Now, this was a measure that had been introduced to try and limit the increasing number of fictitious votes being created. And voters were required to recite an oath stating that they were voting for their own intentions and not that of anyone else. If they refused to take the oath, they lost the right to vote. Now, the Kennedy's voters were asked to take the oath first. 5 of them refused. They were struck off the roll. And then Patrick's voters were asked to take the trust oath. And they did. All of them took the oath. They were well coached, I think. In the archives, I found a copy of the oath. There's a picture of it. The gap is where you put in your name for your vote. And I think everyone has been very well coached. All of Patrick's voters took the oath. And because that then gave George Ferguson more candidates, he carried the day and he was elected to the House of Commons. This election, these results from Ayr caused a huge furore. There was discussion in Parliament about it. There were those who wished to see changes in law, but not a great deal happened. And one of the reasons often given is that in the House of Lords, the majority of Lords were English and they could not understand the Scottish system and were loath to interfere with it. And it's perhaps just as well that they did not. Patrick goes to the House of Lords as a representative peer in 1790, and he works incredibly hard to get there. 16 members in the House of Lords from Scotland. There used to be nearly 80 in the Scottish House of Lords, so very few in comparison. Elected by their fellow peers. Oh, and they're so upset by having to be elected because they argue it is their birthright. Of course, the whole thing is supposed to be done by their fellow peers, but it becomes a fairly corrupt affair with the First Minister in London interfering and threatening. And I just love this quote that I found in the archive. It's not signed, but it says, "How contemptible must be the condition of a set of men who by the resolution of the English can only get admission by election to the House of Lords. Their English counterparts are born to that position. They have a right to be there, but the Scottish members feel distinctly put out because they have to be elected. And Patrick works very hard to be elected. He writes to his brother in 1783, "There are wheels within wheels which you must learn to know. I am a candidate for the peerage and have not been idle." Eventually, though, he is elected, and it takes him so long because fundamentally Patrick is on the wrong side in politics. He supports Charles Fox, who is a very liberal gentleman. Charles Fox is loathed by George I. He has a very short period as First Minister with North, but the elections that were so important to Patrick, with his hopes to get into the House of Lords, William Pitt is elected, and Henry Dundas controls Scottish politics. And really, Patrick is more liberal than Henry Dundas as a politician, and they never got on. But in fact, by the 1790s, many liberal landowners have decided that the less said, the better about offering greater reform and greater liberties to people, because the threat of the French Revolution is alarming many of them and increasing unrest or social unrest at home. So Patrick dies in 1803, and at the very end of his life, he writes this huge list of things that he has done. He's been heavily into improvement and change on his estate. He's been a hugely cultured man. He reads. He has a wonderful copy of Milton's Paradise Lost, printed by the Fowlis brothers in Glasgow. He has done so much on his estate to improve his farms. He's tolerant politically and religiously. He invites Catholics from Glasgow who are being persecuted. He writes to them saying, "Come and live in Cumnock, you're welcome here." But at the end of the day, I think the most important thing to him is his family. And he is a family man. He never forgets his relatives, of which he has many. So many of them die before him, in fact. All his nephews in the East India Company, the East India Army, in the Navy, they all die before him. Only one of his nephews survives, in fact, and goes on to have a huge family. And really, I have to say, thank you to the wonderful Bute Archives at Mount Stewart and to the archivists there. Mount Stewart, the Earls of Dumfries were subsumed into the Bute family, the Marquesses of Bute, and that's where the estates are now. So a bit of hard sell just to finish with. If you haven't been to Mount Stewart on the Isle of Bute, it is an amazing house. Arts and crafts, absolutely wacky, well worth a visit. And the other lovely surprise and finding for me was the Clan MacDougall archive. I stumbled across this accidentally. The one surviving nephew of Patrick's went on to have a huge family who emigrated all over the world. They're still in contact with each other and have been to the house, and they have a superb archive of personal letters. I hope some of you are still awake. I think I've probably talked a little bit too long, but I hope you've enjoyed it and you come and visit our lovely house. Thank you very much.